All right. So thanks everyone for shopping. This is Psych 162, Evolution of Cooperation. And so we're going to start by introducing the teaching fellows, who we have 2 teaching fellows so far. Depending on enrollment, we might wind up with more. But as of right now, we have Anton Golitzer and Julia Marshall, and the tentative section times are Tuesday at 1:30 and Wednesday at 4. I think that we'll see if like I said, if a lot of people enroll, we will probably have more section times. So if neither of these section times work for you, but you want to take the class, don't worry too much about that just yet. Okay, so the focus of this class is cooperation, altruism, our willingness to help others, captured quite eloquently by this Van Gogh painting, The Good Samaritan. And this sort of inclination to help others and be a good person is a really fundamental part of humanity and morality, which has obviously fascinated thinkers for a very long time. And what we're going to do in this class is try and take a somewhat different approach for thinking about these questions than what is typically done. And specifically, we're going to take a quantitative approach. And the idea is we're going to learn the basics of game theory, which provides a mathematical language for describing social interactions in a formal way, such that you can make very clear predictions about things that should happen. The way game theory works is you represent any social situation that you're interested in terms of some sort of payoff matrix, where you've got a set of different players that are interacting, you've got a set of choices available to each of the players, and then each player gets some outcome based on their choices and the other person's choices. And although this seems very simple, it's a totally general language that you can use to describe basically any kind of social interaction you want. And then we're going to learn how to, using this kind of representation, determine what are the Nash equilibria, what are the evolutionarily stable strategies in an interaction like this, and in general what you should expect people to learn to do, or evolution to select people to do in situations like this. And this class is going to involve problem sets, and the problem sets in the exams are going to involve doing simple math, because it's a quantitative approach, but it's just simple algebra. You don't need any kind of math prerequisite for it. There's no calculus. And the sort of goal of the class is to use this very simple math, basically just addition and subtraction, and I guess some multiplication and division, if we really get excited, to give this conceptual understanding of why people behave the way they do. And so the goal is to kind of motivate the quantitative approach by showing you how it helps really understand things in a deeper way than you would just by thinking about it. So now some boring stuff about the details of the class. There's going to be roughly 1 problem set per month that are going to help you develop technical skills. Then there's going to be a reading, either one, and there might be, I think we're going to be more like either 1 or 2 readings. The reading list that's on the syllabus right now isn't final. There might be some modifications to it, but there'll be 1 or 2 readings each class. And the idea is, rather than stuff that you read before class to prepare you for lecture, there are going to be things that I envision reading after class to give you a deeper dive into the material that we talk about in class. You're going to have 1 section per week where you'll discuss readings. The TFs will go over practice problems and help you sort of understand better the quantitative stuff that's covered in the lectures. And at least once or twice, we'll also have you actually play some games that we're talking about in class in an incentivized way, where the person that does or we'll pick someone from each section at the end of the semester proportional to the number of points you earn in the games to get a $20 gift card to Blue State. Incentives are important, and then there's going to be a midterm and a final that will involve the same kind of problems from your problem sets. And the goal is to make the exams interesting. That is not just evaluating you, but like by working through the problems on it, you learn some cool thing that you didn't know before. And the overall grade will be 30% problem sets, 30% midterm, 30% final, and 10% participation. which includes doing the reading responses. And we're going to grade this more like a STEM class than other things, such that the means on things are expected, particularly on the midterm and the final, are expected to be, lower than 95 or whatever, but there will be a curve. And also, I know one of the things that people complained about in the course evals last time was that the tests were way too long. So we're going to make some modification to the midterm and the final so that they will be shorter, but still hopefully interesting and challenging. Okay. Then in terms of sort of basic policies, one thing that I think is super important, as summarized by this op-ed from the New York Times, is the laptops are not good for learning, in my humble opinion. And so for me, it's like I don't have the self-control to like not check my email and stuff like that, even if I'm like at a talk that I think is really interesting. So we're going to have a strict no laptop policy both in lecture and in section. And section, that also means don't be on your phone the whole time. Problem sets are going to be due at the beginning of lecture because we're going to start lecture by going over the problem sets briefly. And so there's no late credit for problem sets because once lecture starts, the answers are out there. Also for the reading responses, they should be emailed to your TF by 8 p.m. the night before section. They're just graded complete, incomplete. It's just like you write a paragraph basically about something you thought was interesting in the reading. It's the way to stimulate discussion about the readings. And just email it to the TF. Also, I should say that I'll post the lecture slides certainly after lecture, and I will do my best to post them before lecture. But I don't recommend just printing them out and taking notes on them. A, because it's a black background, so it'll use up all the ink on campus if you do that. And also, it's not really good for taking notes on. And anyways, I think it's better to sort of freeform write down things that I'm saying rather than just adding to the slides. Attendance is mandatory because there's going to be important learning stuff that happens in section. Okay, so that's the practicalities. And so now on to the real, this is my pitch for why this is an interesting class to take, right? So if we're talking about the evolution of cooperation, we're going to start by saying what's cooperation and what's evolution. So we're going to define cooperation in the context of this class as taking an action that benefits one or more others, and often that involves you incurring a personal cost or at least risking some cost to create that benefit. And so the reason that cooperation is such an interesting thing to study, I should say it's what all my research is on, it's what I spend basically all my time thinking about, and the reason that I think that it's so cool is that on the one hand, it's totally essential for everything in life, basically across all scales of the natural world, from cells in your body, where each cell, when in a healthy body, each cell grows when it's supposed to, dies when it's supposed to, and then you get a breakdown of cooperation with cancer, which within a mutant cell arises that instead of dying when it's supposed to, it just grows as fast as it can without regard for the consequences of other cells, which has very bad overall outcomes for the organism. Then in the social world, like the core to most friendships, interpersonal interactions involves cooperation, doing things that you know are going to help another person, even if it doesn't necessarily help you. These are my kids, who are identical twins, and this was now a year and a half ago, and it makes me wistful. And then scaling up further at the level of organizations, you have like cooperation is a really core component of a successful functioning organization, where people put the sort of interest of the organization ahead of their own narrow interest. And so organizations that involve cooperative people like that are more successful than organizations where people are sort of backstabbing and sort of not looking out for each other. And then at the most macro level, things like conservation and climate change are these global level public goods where everyone is better off if people take steps to try and combat these things that are sort of problematic at a global level, but there's a personal incentive not to. And so what these things from the cells in our body up through the survival of our planet have in common is that they're what we call in game theory non-zero-sum interactions, which is to say when everyone cooperates, everyone's better off. It's socially desirable, but at the same time, cooperation is often challenging because it requires individuals to bear personal costs in order to create those collective benefits. And so both from the perspectives of Darwin and natural selection, which is this selfish process, and from the perspective of classical economics, who I will represent with Adam Smith, although actually Adam Smith himself said a lot of things that acknowledge that people are not actually rationally self-interested. Classical economics assumes that they are. And so from both of these perspectives, you would expect people not to engage in cooperation, even though there are social benefits, because it's individually costly. And so the question that we are going to ask is, how can cooperation evolve and be maintained despite this sort of challenge? And if we're going to talk about evolution, then we have to say, what does evolution mean? So there's sort of three key components to evolution. First, you have to have variation. So within a population, you've got different types of agents, we'll say, in the most general sense. Then there has to be some kind of selection process that occurs, which means that the frequency of types in the population change over time, such that types that are doing better at the current moment become more common, and types that are doing worse become less common. And then you have to have mutation, which is some process that maintains variation in the population by reintroducing new types. And so there's two fundamentally different ways that evolution can work. The first one is genetic evolution, which is what most people think about when they talk about evolution. And so the idea is you've got organisms with different genes, which is what the types are, different genotypes. And then those agents die and reproduce, with your genes affecting how likely it is that you die and how likely it is that you reproduce, such that natural selection occurs where genes that make you more likely to reproduce or less likely to die tend to become more common. And then mutation happens when sometimes the genes that the offspring get don't exactly match the parents' genes, and so that maintains variation in the gene pool. And so that's just sort of standard genetic evolution, but there's also cultural evolution, or social learning, which is a process that happens, rather than over the time scale of generations. It happens just, within our lives. And you have people with differing, what Dawkins called memes, so different beliefs, preferences, social norms, strategies, ideas, whatever. And these different features of individuals, I'm going to call it, in the game theoretic term, I'm going to call it a strategy, but that's just going to sort of define everything about how a person makes choices. And those different strategies lead to differential levels of success. And people sometimes decide to change their strategy, and the way they do that is they look around and they say, who seems to be doing well? Okay, let me copy the people that are successful. And so that means that natural selection occurs in this space of memes, where memes that make you more successful and therefore more likely to be imitated tend to spread through the population. And here mutation can take two different forms. One is sometimes I think that, so I say, oh, Julia's really successful, let me copy her strategy, but I get confused about what her strategy is. And so there's not perfect copying, and so I pick some new strategy because I thought it's what she was doing, but I was wrong. Or it could also be innovation, where I purposely say, I'm not going to copy anyone, I'm just going to try something. Either try something at random or try something that I think makes sense. But either way, that's sort of introducing new variation into the population. And the thing that's cool is that regardless of whether it's genetic evolution or it's this kind of social learning, the exact same math can describe both of these processes. And both of them basically understand how the composition of the population will change over time. It does it in a predictable way, such that higher payoff strategies become more common, and the population can reach an equilibrium, which is to say, when the population is in equilibrium, any new mutant that was to arrive, that is, if anyone was to change their strategy, they would get a lower payoff than they're currently getting. And so that means when you're in a situation where no one could improve their payoff by switching, then that's like a stable outcome that you should expect as a long-run outcome.
So you said that the same math can describe both processes. What's like the cultural analog for, like, if we're talking about Hamilton's rule here on cooperation, what's the cultural analog for like the coefficient of relatedness? There's one.
We'll talk about that in some detail later. I think that the short answer is I'm not a huge fan of Hamilton's rule. I think it's not a super general thing. Okay, so if we want to now talk about the evolution of cooperation, there's a lot of different games that we'll talk about that describe cooperation, but the one that we're going to focus the most on is the prisoner's dilemma, which is a sort of class of problem called a social dilemma. And in its most basic form, the idea of the prisoner's dilemma is you have two people, and they each make a simultaneous choice about whether to help each other or not. Where helping means incurring some cost in order to give the other person benefits. In this example, they each decide they want to give up 1 unit in order to give the other person 3 units or not. And this very simple formulation can capture basically everything, the essence of everything from cells and cancer up to climate change, because it captures this tension between what's individually optimal and what's collectively optimal. So to study the prisoner's dilemma, we put it into this sort of game theoretic matrix. So we say we've got our 2 different players. Each player has a choice to either cooperate, which means paying the cost to give the benefit, or defect, which means doing nothing. And then we can say, well, okay, for each possible combination of the 2 players' moves, what payoff do each of them get? So, so to make it a little easier, I'm going to color code it, where we're going to say that the second player cooperating is going to be in blue, and the first player cooperating is going to be in green, and we can look at the contribution that each of those things makes to the player's payoffs. So let's start in this cell here where both people cooperate. So if player 1 cooperates, that means in this sort of abstract sense, so here I'm giving a specific example of paying a cost of 1 to give a benefit of 3, but you can think about just a more general one of you pay any cost C in order to give some benefit B to the other person. So if player 1 cooperates, that means that she incurs this cost and she gives the benefit to the other person. We're going to have this general nomenclature where there's going to be 1 cell for each outcome, and there's going to be 2 numbers, player 1's payoff and then comma player 2's payoff. And so here, the fact that player 1 is cooperating means that she's incurring this cost and giving the benefit B to the other guy. And player 2 is cooperating, and so that means he also pays this cost, but in return gives the benefit to player 1. So both of them get B minus C. And so assuming that the benefit is greater than the cost, that is to say it's positively non-zero sum, benefit is created through cooperation, this means both of these numbers are positive. In contrast, if both people defect, no one gets anything. So this is the sense in which the prisoner's dilemma captures mutual cooperation is better for both parties than mutual defection. So you see the social efficiency, this sort of gain that comes through cooperating. But at the same time, let's think about what happens when one person cooperates and the other one defects. So here, if player 1 cooperates and player 2 defects, player 1 pays the cost C and gives the benefit B to player 2, and player 2 doesn't do anything. And the opposite is here too, where player 2 cooperates, he pays the cost, and player 1 gets the benefit. And so this is what makes this really interesting, which is despite the fact that mutual cooperation is better than mutual defection, no matter what the other person does, you always individually earn more by defecting than cooperating. Because, so say we'll just take the perspective of player 1, if player 2 cooperates, cooperating gets you B minus C, and defecting gets you B. So there's no point in paying the cost. That is, you do better to not pay the cost. And same thing here, if player 2 defects, you pay the cost or you get nothing. And so even though both people would be better off if they mutually cooperated, if each person follows their self-interest, they're both going to wind up defecting and wind up worse off than they would have been if they both cooperated. And so as a result, if you have a population where, so say here's our population of agents where the defectors are red and the cooperators are blue, because no matter what, the defectors are always earning higher payoffs than the cooperators, natural selection is going to wind up favoring defection. Defection is going to spread through the population, and cooperation is going to die out. And so an interesting feature of this is people think about evolution as a process that maximizes fitness. But here's a case where by maximizing the individual's fitness, evolution actually makes the population worse off than it was before we started considering selection. And so what we're going to spend most of this class doing is trying to understand what's missing from this story. This is a very pessimistic story which says no one should ever cooperate. But cooperation is this fundamental aspect of life that not only is it very important, but it's also very common. In the next lecture, we'll give lots of examples of cooperation occurring in our lives to motivate this. So the real question is how to explain that. And another way of saying it is, what's missing from this prisoner's dilemma description of social interaction? And, or in other words, what can we add to the prisoner's dilemma to make it so that evolution will favor cooperation? And so there's broadly two different classes of mechanisms that we'll talk about that resolve this dilemma, reciprocity and assortment. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a little overview of each of these things. Basically, each of the things we're about to talk about in one slide gets one lecture. Or maybe two lectures, depending on which one it is. So the sort of oldest of these mechanisms is direct reciprocity. The idea is we say we've got these two people playing a prisoner's dilemma, and the way we talked about it before is it's just each person makes a choice and then the game's over. But in life, most of your important interactions aren't just one-off anonymous interactions, but they're repeated interactions with your friends, your coworkers, your family members, such that you don't just make a choice in a vacuum, but your choice today can reflect what the other person did in the past. And so that means it can pay off to cooperate in order to induce your partner to cooperate with you the next time you interact. So that works very well for pairs. But then what about situations where you're interacting only once with someone, but it's not in a vacuum? Say other people are watching, and in particular people that you might interact with in the future. This is where we have indirect reciprocity or reputation mechanisms come in, such that it can pay off for me to pay the cost of cooperating with this person today, so that this person who's observing me will think I have a good reputation and be willing to cooperate with me in the future. This can also work in the context of social networks, where if you imagine that not everybody interacts with everyone, but interactions are embedded in some kind of network where you only interact with those people that you are friends with or neighbors with or seek out or whatever. And then, in this situation, if cooperating means you help all the people that you're connected with, and you receive cooperation back from the cooperators that you're connected to, but not from the defectors, which means that these mutual cooperation links are beneficial to you, whereas these links with defectors are costly to you, then if you give people control over their networks, so you can decide, who, at least to some extent, who you interact with, that means that you'll be inclined to break links with defectors, and you'll be inclined to make links with cooperators. And so in this domain, it can pay off in the long run to cooperate in order to gain social capital and attract people to want to interact with you. And then if you zoom out even further to macro level things like conservation behaviors, those are true public goods in the sense that your good behavior benefits everyone in the world. But still, reciprocity can maintain this kind of cooperation if your behavior is made accountable in the sense that if your choice about whether or not to provision these sort of global public goods is made observable to the people that you interact with in your pairwise relationships, then you make it so that these people can condition their personal cooperation on you. It can be conditioned on your global level behaviors, such that it becomes worth it for you to provision these global public goods in order to make your friends more inclined to cooperate with you. And so all three of these, or all however many of these things I just talked about, operate in the same way, which is they take a social dilemma where, in the prisoner's dilemma, as we said, defection always out-earns cooperation, which is what makes it a dilemma. And all of these different mechanisms create future consequences for your current behavior. And what that means is it transforms the social dilemma into a situation involving coordination, which is to say, rather than defection always beating cooperation, it becomes the case that cooperation actually pays off in the long run if you're matched with someone who's also willing to cooperate with you. And so what that means is that when you are in situations with future consequences, then cooperation can actually pay off in the long run. That is, there can be strategic motives to cooperate. That, I think, explains a lot of human cooperation. But the thing is, it's also possible to get cooperation to evolve in situations where there are not future consequences. It's what I call pure cooperation rather than strategic cooperation. And these more or less all boil down into versions of one of two different things, which are maybe two versions of the same thing, depending on who you ask. And it's again, based on the idea that not everyone interacts with everyone randomly, but there is structure to the population and there's structure to your interactions. So say we've got this set of blue cooperators and red defectors. If just everyone interacts with everyone, the defectors are going to win. But if there's some kind of network structure or interaction structure such that you only interact with people near you, and if it's the case that there's some kind of what we call assortment, so that is, people aren't just matched at random, but you are more likely, like people near you in the network are more likely to have the same strategy as you, then it creates clusters of cooperators and clusters of defectors that are sort of mutually reinforcing and can make cooperation pay off. And so, again, the idea here is not everyone interacts with everyone else, which allows these clusters of cooperators and defectors to arise, and that means that cooperators are more likely to interact with other cooperators than with defectors, because if you're in a cluster of cooperators, you're going to play with other cooperators. And so that means that not only do cooperators, so the problem of the social dilemma is that cooperators bear the cost of cooperating, the defectors don't. But when there's assortment and there are these clusters, then it makes it so that cooperators, not only do they have to pay the cost of cooperation, but they also get more access to the benefits of cooperation because they're more likely to be matched with other cooperators. And so if that clustering is strong enough, it can cause people that cooperate in one-shot games to actually do better than people that don't. And then the other form of population structure that's received a lot of attention is to imagine that rather than talking about some kind of interconnected network like that, you imagine separate groups. And so say that you've got these 6 different groups, and these groups are all made up of defectors, and this group is all cooperators, and this is a mixed group. And then the idea is the agents interact within the groups, and evolution, and they sort of compete with each other for reproduction within groups, so you have normal evolution going on inside each group. But then also sometimes there's conflict between groups. And groups with more cooperators, because they're better able to mobilize collective action, groups with more cooperators are basically beat groups of defectors in group level competition. And so what that means is even though within each group, defectors are going to beat cooperators, as in the standard, we were talking about before, when there's conflict between groups, cooperators can spread. And this is called group selection, or in the sort of it was a reinvention of group selection in the last 20 years or so, where they started calling it multi-level selection. But the basic idea, again, is that even though within groups defectors beat cooperators, when groups compete, groups with more cooperators out-earn groups with defectors, either there's sort of two different ways that you can think about this happening. One is literally there's groups that just fight with each other, and one group kills the other group, and then they resettle the area that they were living in. Or in a more sort of cultural domain, it could be that when there's conflict, the winning group gets to impose their norms on the losing group. And so in that way, norms that prescribe cooperation can spread. And there's no question that this mechanism works from a mathematical perspective, but there's a long history of debate about how relevant this sort of group level selection was for explaining human behavior, because in order for this to work, you really need a lot of conflict between groups, and there's debate about whether historically there was enough of that conflict to actually support cooperation or not. But so these are the things that we'll call mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. And what we're going to do in this class is we're going to understand each of these mechanisms from a theoretical perspective, again, using some simple math to understand the conditions for cooperation to succeed through each of these different mechanisms, and sort of understanding in more depth conceptually how they work. And then we'll also talk about some empirical evidence assessing the effectiveness of each of these mechanisms to actually promote human behavior. And some of that is going to be by looking at lab experiments where we bring people in and have them actually play these games for real money, and see what happens. And then also part of it is looking at field studies and experiments happening in the real world with sort of real behavior. And so that's the basic sketch of what we're going to do for, say, the first half-ish of the class. Is going to be really digging into these mechanisms. And then what we're going to do for the second half of the class is we're going to use these conceptual frameworks that we studied in the first half to look at a series of special topics that are involving human behavior that are interesting and important. So one section will be looking at sort of cognitive lens on cooperation and trying to understand sort of cognitive underpinnings of cooperation, again, in light of those mechanisms. And we're primarily going to focus on this distinction that goes back at least to Plato between reason and emotion. And so you've got this charioteer who has his emotions are wild horses, dragging the chariot around, and then reason is the charioteer driving, corralling the horses and driving the chariot where it's supposed to go. And this has been popularized more recently by Danny Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for basically inventing behavioral economics. And he had this popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that the year it came out was, I think, the most bought and the least actually read book. But at my family holiday, it was the modal gift, where everybody got it for everybody else, basically. But the idea, again, is so he uses this fast and slow language to talk about reason, emotion versus reason. So you have fast, automatic, emotional, sort of gut feeling processes that then compete with more sort of slow, controlled, cognitive, rational processes. And a lot of my personal research has been about this and basically making the argument that we'll sort of unpack in class that although most people usually think about sort of emotion as selfish and reason as the thing that motivates you to act for the greater good, I argue that in a lot of situations it's the opposite, and we're sort of intuitively predisposed towards cooperation, and deliberation and sort of rationality moves us in the direction of self-interest. So that's one thing we'll talk about. And I guess as part of this also we'll have one lecture that's just sort of intro to behavioral economics in general, because I think that's interesting and cool. And then we'll also talk about phylogeny and development, so non-human animals, primates in particular, and thinking about how they cooperate, and then also studies with kids. This is a little young human cooperation that occurred recently. Anyways. So also you'll see I have at least one picture of the kids in every lecture and try and keep myself to one. So because it's the first lecture, I'm overdoing it. Also because today was their first day of daycare. So I'm, a little teary-eyed. So we'll talk about cooperation in non-human animals and cooperation in kids. Then we'll also talk about cross-cultural differences in cooperation. There's a lot of evidence that people's willingness to help anonymous strangers varies markedly across countries. And there's various different theories about why this should be. And again, we'll talk about how different mechanisms that we learned in the first course can help explain why prosociality varies across countries and the patterns in which it occurs. And also a little bit about how you might be able to change some of these patterns. Another topic that we'll talk about is religion and the evolution of religion, which, although not the same thing as cooperation, religion and cooperation are fairly intertwined in that most religious traditions place a major emphasis on the importance of cooperation, at least with co-religionists, as the jargon goes, at least with other members of the same religion. And so a lot of the theories to explain the evolution of religion involve cooperation and sort of the co-evolution of religion and cooperation. And as to say, the reason that the evolution of religion is a sort of interesting puzzle in the first place is that religion often involves a lot of very individually costly behaviors, rituals, things like that. And the question is, how do we explain the basically ubiquitous existence of these behaviors that seem like they should be disfavored by selection? And again, the ability of religion to promote cooperation is one popular answer to that question. And then another thing that we'll talk about is in-group bias and prejudice. Again, there's a huge amount of work in social psychology documenting people's inclination to preferentially cooperate with people that are similar to them and not cooperate or even sort of be spiteful towards people that are different. And this again is, an evolutionarily interesting question, because you should either expect people shouldn't be cooperating with anyone if it's a self-interest situation, or if there's some, if there's some gain to be had by cooperating, you should be doing it with everyone, regardless of group membership. And so we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about, both again the theory weighting and some experiments, and then we'll conclude by talking about practical applications of the stuff we're talking about to solving real-world cooperation challenges. And among other things, I direct this Yale Applied Cooperation team, where we work with lots of different organizations, government, NGO, and private companies to run field experiments, helping them basically using our basic science knowledge to help them solve cooperation problems that they are facing. And so I'll describe some of this work and other field work of this flavor. And so that is the 40-minute overview of what we're going to do for the semester in this class. I'll also make a plug that if you find this stuff interesting and want to get more involved in the actual research part, our lab is always looking for RAs. You get to work with a grad student or a postdoc and me. You'll learn how to design studies, we run most of our experiments online, so you'll learn how to sort of build these online experiments and run them and analyze the data and come up with conclusions and iterate on that. And so if you're interested in potentially RAing in the lab, we're having a first lab meeting next Wednesday the 6th at 2 p.m. in Kirtland 101B. So if you're interested, you should come, or if you can't make that time, if you're interested, just send me an email. So that's the overview. Next class we'll dig into what cooperation means and why it's interesting and why it's a puzzle. And can I ask one quick sort of survey question in terms of the section times? If you think you are probably interested in taking the class, can you indicate the extent to which you would be able to do a section at 1:30 on Tuesdays? So raise your hand if you could do 1:30 on Tuesdays. All right, there's some social consensus here. So That is checking whether you can do it. Okay, great. And what about Wednesday at 4? All right, cool. And then what? Who is interested in taking the class but couldn't do either of those times? Okay. That is very helpful.
There's no next
What?
There's no section.
Oh yeah, and there's no section the first week. That is next week, while we work out the times and all that stuff. So thanks, and hopefully see you next class.
I'm not sure if you have this information, but do you know